It is hard to believe that we are now 5 months into the coronavirus pandemic. This event has demonstrated the fragility of our social and economic systems, especially for the most vulnerable, including billions of young people around the world. Yet the crisis has also demonstrated the resilience, creativity, and leadership of young people, as well as organizations like you who are working to support them right now. All of us, development practitioners, funders, policymakers, and young people, are trying to make sense of this changing landscape, adapt to the immediate challenges, and predict the road ahead. In a typical year, the GYEO Summit convenes over 4 days in the fall in Washington, D.C., and brings together nearly 500 youth experts and innovators from 75+ countries. Our community includes international implementers, academic and research institutions, funders and policymakers, the private sector, and young people, including many young social impact entrepreneurs. Clearly, this year required a different approach, one that begins now in the midst of the crisis, and that convenes experts and youth voices to better understand the current situation. We will elevate stories of partners who are collaborating in innovative ways and help to gather and share critical information, tools, and ideas under the summit theme, Reimagining Youth Economic Opportunities in a Post-Pandemic World. At the heart of this agenda are 2 key questions. What are the immediate impacts of COVID-19 on young people, and how have our organizations responded? And how can what we are learning now inform what we do next to build more resilient, inclusive systems for youth economic opportunity in a post-pandemic world, or at least one where we are better prepared for future shocks? Our adapted virtual series is organized around our 4 traditional summit technical tracks on skills development, workforce readiness, self-employment, and entrepreneurship, and cross-cutting issues like gender, conflict, system change, and scale. You can find a full schedule of upcoming track events on our summit site at youtheosummit.org. We will add additional online events in development with our partners to this page, so stay tuned for updates. Or you can join our GYEO network mailing list. Our summit track, Livelihoods Through Self-Employment, addresses the rise of self-employment in the formal economy and the high levels of informality in most developing economies. Even as self-employment and entrepreneurship can offer greater freedom and self-reliance for some, this trend also poses critical challenges for many. The impact of COVID-19 has demonstrated how deeply vulnerable the predominantly young, self-employed, gig, contract, and seasonal workforce is to shocks. How can we rethink self-employment and entrepreneurship in light of the challenges and opportunities presented by the current crisis? And how do we ensure that as we rebuild, young people are better protected and able to build their own businesses in a recovering economy? We are very lucky to be joined by 3 speakers representing different perspectives on self-employment to help us begin thinking through some of these issues. Joining us from Mozambique, Jessica Osborn is a director at Caribou Digital and an experienced digital economies consultant who jointly leads the MasterCard Foundation's Learning Partnership, as well as Caribou Digital's Live Learning program, which provides immersive study visits to emerging markets. Jessica has also worked for Alphabet's IoT company Nest, Google in Nairobi, Millicom Ghana, and the Grameen Foundation in Ghana and Uganda. Jessica's blogs on the impact of COVID-19 on African gig workers and what needs to be done, as well as platform-led upskilling, a joint blog with the MasterCard Foundation, can be found on the track page on our summit site. Joining us from Jordan, Muhannad Jarrah is the Executive Director of INJAZ Education. Muhannad is an internationally recognized leader in the field of institutions and has managed the organization's operations since 2000, supporting INJAZ to become a leader in financial education nationally and internationally. Muhannad also serves on the board of Destination Imagination and was elected to represent Arab countries on the Aflatoon International Board. He also serves as the chairperson for the International Association of Facilitation's Jordan chapter. And finally, joining us from Bolivia, Wendy Murubia is the co-founder and director of Ciudad Mundo Foundation. She's a social entrepreneur who works to promote the comprehensive development of young people through programs and projects that combine international travel with personal and professional growth. The intent is that Bolivians will have better academic and job opportunities and become leaders with a spirit of service. She is a 2016 YLife Fellow, a former Youth Lead Ambassador, and a current member of the Youth Power 2 Learning and Evaluation, or YP2LE, Youth Advisory Group. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for joining us this morning. We are thrilled to have you. We're going to start with our first speaker, Jessica Osborn. Thank you so much for being here. Then we'll move to Muhannad, and then we will end with remarks from Wendy. and then we'll have a bit of time at the end for some Q&A. So we will be gathering your questions, and we'll try to get to all of them as much as we can. So Jessica, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Hi from Maputo. I'm going to share a little bit about the work we've been doing over the last couple of years on young people and access to meaningful work in sub-Saharan Africa. As I'm going through, I'd really encourage people to enter some questions in the chat or the Q&A sections. It would be really great to have a dialogue about this. I'm very curious about what other people's thoughts are as well. So as Sarah mentioned, I work for a consulting company called Caribou Digital. We specialize in helping clients work towards building ethical digital economies and doing that particularly in emerging markets. At Caribou, I co-lead the MasterCard Foundation Learning Partnership. We were previously focused on financial inclusion, but in the last few years, we've started looking at access to meaningful and dignified work to align with MasterCard Foundation's new strategy called Young Africa Works. And I'm really pleased to be able to share some of the insights from our recent work with you today. Recently, we've been really exploring the role of the private sector in upskilling young people. We've been especially interested in how marketplace platforms or gig platforms have been playing a big role in plugging skills gaps through training. Although people selling on e-commerce platforms or driving for ride-hailing companies, for example, are not employees, those platforms that they're working on are actually investing a lot of time and money in training them. And they're doing that because they have to. We spent a long time last year talking to gig platforms operating all over the world, and they told us without exception that this training is just a necessary part of doing business for them. And this was true right across the board, from Alibaba's Taobao in China, to Gojek in Indonesia, Sendi and Link in Kenya, Gokada and Jumia in Nigeria. Without this training, there are just too many skills barriers for gig workers, and particularly young gig workers, to be able to overcome to successfully transact on those platforms. And we found that platforms are training across a relatively broad range of topics as well. And it includes things like financial literacies, vocational skills, digital literacy, and soft skills like customer service. We think of this as skills for digital age. And what we mean by that is, it's not enough to just consider digital literacy when we're thinking about upskilling. It's this broader range of competencies, so including things like the financial literacy, vocational skills, and soft skills. It's that broader range of competencies that is required for workers to gain access to opportunities in the digital economy. And it's really interesting that platforms are training gig workers on this, because those skills are actually lifelong and they're useful beyond the remit of those specific platforms that are doing those trainings. So that means that the skills are actually potentially transformative to the livelihoods of the millions of workers in sub-Saharan Africa who are earning their incomes through digital platforms today, most of them people. So in summary, platform companies are now part of the training landscape alongside traditional educational institutions like TVETs. And yes, we acknowledge that there are issues around gig worker dignity, privacy protection, agency, fairly shared value, and those issues are serious and they need to be addressed. But we think that alongside that cautionary narrative, we as a development community need to do a better job of recognizing the positive impacts of these gig platforms as well, and recognize the positive impacts they're having on young people beyond just income generation. And we think that skilling is one example. And it's with this lens that we see the impacts of COVID-19 on the gig work sector. So the pandemic has really foregrounded this tension between platforms' ability to have a positive impact and the extreme precariousness of the work they create. Since March, we've been speaking to a group of about 10 marketplace platforms in sub-Saharan Africa and 30 young people offering their services or goods through them in Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, and Uganda. What we found is that on the one hand, digital marketplaces we spoke to in Africa are trying their best to support workers on their platforms during this time. All of them we spoke to are educating their workers on how to avoid COVID transmission and are distributing or covering the cost of PPE and sanitizer. And a lot of these companies have pivoted their businesses in an impressively short period of time in an effort to survive the crisis. And of course, as they do this, they're generating new types of work for the people on their platforms. So for example, platforms offering place-based work, so I'm thinking of platforms that are connecting cleaners, carpenters, and other kinds of tradespeople to gigs. They've tried to negotiate contracts to connect people with COVID response roles like fumigation and sanitation. Some ride-hailing companies are offering special services for health workers and at-risk individuals, such as hospital rides for pregnant women in labour. And they're doing this as a way to try to have a positive impact and also create opportunities for their riders in order to maintain their incomes. Logistics companies like Safe Boda and Sendi, for example, in Kenya, and Uganda have quickly started offering e-grocery services, including connecting small market vendors to customers. And that's generating more opportunity, ride opportunities for their drivers as well. Agricultural platform Twiga in Kenya has partnered with Jumia to better connect farmers with customers. And recruitment platforms like Jobberman and Shortlist have both started offering skills training to people seeking work through their platforms, so that at least they're helping to put this time out of work to good use. This effort from platforms to enable people to continue to work in a safe way is probably providing them with more support, assistance, and stability than other informal workers on the continent are getting at the moment. Certainly, this seems to be the case from conversations we've had with people who are not offering their services and goods through these platforms. So people who are selling more informally, for example, through Facebook and Instagram, those kinds of sellers and workers told us that they're essentially invisible. No company is looking out for them. No one is trying to generate more sales for them, and they're really out there on their own. Despite the valiant efforts of digital platforms and I just spoke through a few of those examples, it's just not enough. The workers we spoke to told us without exception that their incomes have been drastically reduced and they're struggling to provide basic shelter and nutrition for their families. And this is a story that we've heard echoed by gig workers around the globe, including in Europe and North America. Those in more developed markets, some governments like the US, for example, have temporarily extended eligibility for unemployment benefits to gig workers. Under pressure from labor groups and governments, platform companies like Uber and Bolt have introduced some level of sick pay for drivers who are infected with or sheltering from COVID-19. Interestingly though, Bolt did not extend this benefit to its drivers in Africa. But this backstopping from companies and governments is unlikely to be replicated in sub-Saharan Africa. African digital platforms are mostly young companies whose work is pretty tough even without a pandemic. Running a profitable business while we're battling with poor infrastructure, skills gaps, high operating costs, and unclear or whimsically changing regulation is really hard. These companies generally lack the deep pockets of their well-financed Silicon Valley counterparts, and they just don't have the cash to be able to support workers on their platforms through a downturn. Governments here also have budgets that were strained even before this pandemic. The loan forgiveness and utility cost waivers that many of them have introduced are unlikely to have much impact on people's livelihoods, and cash transfer schemes are probably more important than ever. The young workers we spoke to have been really creative, however, in trying to find new opportunities as this pandemic continues to unfold. I'll give you a few examples. Dorcas, a lady we've been speaking to in Nairobi, who used to sell cakes through Facebook, has now set up a WhatsApp group to connect other trades and services people to customers in her area of Nairobi. She's also encouraging workers to share marketing and survival tips with each other. Godwin, who was working for Uber and Bolt in Accra when we first spoke to him in March, has now found a job as a part-time manager of a mango farm. Daniel in Kenya told us about the community of freelancers on Facebook and WhatsApp, where people pass on work opportunities to those who have less or are struggling. In Uganda, Edith, who writes product reviews on Upwork, said she is using the downtime to diversify her skill set by learning data visualization on Udemy. These efforts notwithstanding, people are struggling with far less income than before. The pandemic has revealed just how extremely precarious gig work is and how non-existent safety nets are for these workers, especially in developing countries. Platform business models, as they currently stand, are just not built to provide more security and safety nets, though some have tried with inbuilt financial services like health insurance and savings schemes. But building worker resilience should not be the duty of platforms alone. Platforms alone should not be responsible for carrying workers through drops in demand. The ILO has talked about how the gig economy has rendered traditional classifications of employed and self-employed as problematic, leaving gig workers occupying a sort of policy grey area. They argue that new legal frameworks to classify gig workers are needed to inform policy debate and ensure adequate social protection for all workers. Hopefully, this pandemic will serve to create some urgency around reducing the precariousness of gig work so that these people will not be left so vulnerable again in the future. Back over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Super interesting commentary. And I think I like that you've highlighted the tension between the positive aspects of these platforms with some of the negative drawbacks, and particularly the vulnerability of workers without safety nets. And I'd love to come back to that in the discussion around how we better connect some of these policy issues and the role of governments versus platforms versus training providers, and whose role is it to upskill and at what scale? But I want to turn to our next speaker, Muhannad, who is joining us from Jordan and INJAZ Education, to offer some of his own insights from where he is in the MENA region, and in particular, some institutional insights as an organization that has had to pivot very quickly. I know that in this community, so many of us are, concerned about youth development issues, as well as trying to adapt our own organizations to be effective to the new situation, and thinking through how do we reach young people, how do we train, how do we move things online, how do we protect and support our staff overseas and at home. So Muhannad, it's great to have you here, and over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you, Making Sense, for putting this great conference. First, I would like to start by saying, it's very important to look at this and saying when we say, physical distancing compared to social distancing, and I believe we should always think of more physical distancing and avoid the word social distancing, because that's very important to keep the human element as we go into digital transformation and working online. When a COVID crisis hit, it came by surprise. Really, we were not prepared for it. In Jordan, we had complete shutdown. Airports were closed, businesses were closed. We in INJAZ also, we were asked to stay at home. So it came like a surprise. We did not expect this. At the beginning, it was tough. We did not know really how to handle this at the beginning. Then we started to look at different ways we can integrate our work to be able to deliver our programs. So we had a lot of challenges. How are we going to manage the volunteers that we work with? How are we going to deliver our programs online? How are we going to look at the cultural issues with the youth as we deliver online compared to in-person delivery? So we started to take it into small pieces. At the beginning, we had our team, selected staff members who had some educational background, go to our offices, and we started to videotape our session, our financial education session in INJAZ. And then we aligned with the Ministry of Education and the TV, and we started to put our financial education curricula on TV, on national TV. Then after that, we said, okay, we do not want to think on organizational structure. We want to dismantle our organizational structure. So we took all the hierarchy out, and we mapped the skills in our team. So each member will know his or her own skills, and we match them to a project that we need to adapt in. So for example, people with IT background, even if they are not working in INJAZ in IT, they are matched to how we can digitalize our programs, and so on. And I believe this kind of thinking of not looking in organization structure, but to look on skills and mapping the skills gave us a big advantage in this adaptation. After that, we started to develop our platform, and we started to use first simple things like WhatsApp and Zoom. And then actually, we started to run our sessions at university using these platforms. At the beginning, it was challenging, but slowly, we started really to understand how youth are interested to really see the programs happening online. Then after that, we started to go to schools. And in schools, we were faced with cultural issues because many parents were not comfortable having their daughters to be in a virtual setting because they are used in an in-person setting in the school where you have the teacher, you have the physical classroom. So there was a cultural barrier at that time, and this is where we start to think how we address this. And we worked, we start to work with the parents of the students and our team members were going into all the chat rooms and platforms that we have designed to ensure that we give, the parents that their daughters and sons are in a safe place. After that, we started to look beyond that, where we start to align more with the Ministry of Education. And the Ministry of Education at that time started to teach the students online. And we have aligned with the Ministry of Education or put our programs online so it's accessible for the student. During this, we made really, it was a learning process for us, and we made really 3 strategic decisions. The first one, before COVID-19, it was nice really to have some kind of online programming or online teaching. It was not really a must. It was something nice to have. But after COVID, the strategic thinking in our organization, we started to look, yes, and every time we design a program from scratch, from the initial design stage, we will look at putting a hybrid approach where we can develop the program online and offline. And after that, we started to look really how we're going to include everybody in this digital transformation to ensure that we don't leave anyone outside, especially with rural areas where sometimes connectivity is an issue, and also some students or youth don't have access to hardware, either mobiles or laptops or PCs. And that's still a challenge, but we are trying now more to look at better ways of engaging and aligning in partnership to ensure this is really a challenge is being handled. It's important, as we go through to start to look at digitalization and putting the program delivery and volunteer management delivery online, because really this is not, it seems that this is not just one time, but this disruption is happening again and still happening. And that's why it's very important to start to look at investing in moving the programs online. And in INJAZ, we decided to start to look at what we call liquid approach or liquid learning, where actually we are thinking of designing our programs into virtual school setting, where they have the parents are engaged, the teacher are engaged, the volunteers who are delivering our programs are engaged, and the youth are engaged. So it's a real-time study in a virtual setting, which is the new trend of what we call liquid learning. I would like to share my screen for a few slides I would like to share. The first one is a slide from a book by Parker, where he says, a vision without action is merely a dream. Action without vision just passes the time. Vision with action can change the world. So it's important as we put the plans on ground to transform the organization and the programs to have a vision where we are going. And this leads me to my second slide, which is the difference between optimization and agile innovation, which is the SUCO and the FUCA. And it's very important, if we look at examples, for example, the Kodak, they started the filming and they were the leaders in the world in filming, but did not see that digital filming and photographing is coming. So that's why they always were doing a SUCA work, which is more optimization of operations, while they are not seeing that the trend is going there. And this is where we talk on the right side, which is about VUCA, V for volatile, U for uncertainty, C for complex, and A for ambiguous, which is about agile innovation. And this is where organization has to look into building the future scenarios and to understand what's happening so they can adjust and to have an agile business model into really going forward. So it's important that in this crisis and in this area of COVID, to start to think, how we can be agile and understand how we can adapt in an agile setting, and not just to think of optimization our work and doing things better without seeing the future. The second slide I would like to highlight is a slide from Brookings Millions Learning Report published in 2016, where it's clearly have identified that innovation happens on the peripheral, either through a private sector or not-for-profit or government, and then it goes into the system change. So it's important this uncertainty time to really look at how we can support exploration and experimenting, and really innovation solution for what's happening now on ground can come from simple things on the peripheral, and these can be scaled up as we go into the system approach and really transforming digitally the work we do. The last slide here I would like to highlight is the thinking of design thinking, where actually it's important really to use these tools into aligning, the team you are working with and how we can come up with innovative solution. And as a design thinker practitioner, I strongly believe that using design thinking tools will help us into putting things together and get the brains together to come up with solutions. And I have, started a voluntary community, which is called Design Thinking Community, with the yellow D, where actually it put the work of how design thinking happening for communities, and anyone is welcome to join. That's my initial remarks. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Muhannad. So this is really interesting. Jess helped kind of paint the picture of where we are with self-employment, and in particular the role of these digital platforms and skilling. But you brought it back down to the organizational level, and I really appreciate how you kind of talked through the process that INJAZ Education went through to adapt and pivot. Definitely placed an emphasis on systems thinking, which has been something we've explored through the summit the past few years, both inside your organization. I thought in particular this idea of mapping the skills of your team and identifying how you can map them to adapt and pivot is super interesting. I'd love to come back to that. But you also touched on some of the cultural issues around education. We're going through that here in the US. That is not unique to a certain region. That's happening everywhere. I think it's going to be an enormous challenge. And then you also referenced this issue of connectivity and how we help ensure we don't leave anyone behind. So as we're forced to really scale up digital platforms and digital skilling, which had been sort of a nice thing and now you're saying is a really critical thing, this is going to be a key question for our community of how we make sure that we don't end up widening the digital divide and leaving people behind. So I really do appreciate your remarks. And I see some questions coming in that relate to, the resources to do this kind of work. Cole has been posting some of the resources referenced in the chat box as well. And we do encourage you to keep bringing your questions in through the Q&A box as we go forward. So with that, I want to turn to our next speaker, Wendy Meruvia. And again, it's a kind of organizational focus, but Wendy is unique in that she's bringing to this the perspective of a young social impact entrepreneur who has been running her own organization in Bolivia. And Wendy and I had talked some weeks ago about some of the things that she's going through as a founder of an organization and figuring out how to adapt to COVID-19. So Wendy, thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to turn it over to you to share your remarks. And again, folks, if you want to add your questions in the Q&A box, please do so, and we will try to get to them before the end of this session.
Well, hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here sharing with you some of our experience here in Bolivia, South America. And well, it's been very
Yep, we lost you, Wendy.
For us. Ciudad Mundo, which in English means world city. It's a small organization that works with the cultural exchange. Yeah.
So we're having some connectivity issues with Wendy's internet this morning, and
Hello?
I think there's some delay, and now you are back. I can hear you. Go ahead, Wendy, let's give it another try.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Go ahead, Wendy.
Hello, guys, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry, my internet is not very stable, so I'm gonna try to share my screen with you and not video screen now.
We do not see your screen yet.
Hello?
But we can hear you.
Again.
Oh, there you go.
Okay,
yep,
perfect.
We
so I'm just going to continue. Perfect. So thank you. I'm so sorry. I don't know what's going on.
All good. Go for it.
So as I was saying, Ciudad Mundo, thank you, Sarah. Ciudad Mundo works with cultural exchange programs. So for example, this year we were supposed to send about 100 students. Could already guess we weren't able to send anyone. Something was going to happen in the world economy. I mean, we had that in mind because, you know, with a economy cycle that, you know, that happens from, I don't know, every 8 years, something like you have total success in the economy and then down. So the economical crisis, then we're going to have local programs because during a crisis, people might not travel as much. But guess what? The COVID came, lockdown, and we never thought, you know, our plan B wouldn't work. So what did we do? And this is something that I am sharing in a very like general way of young entrepreneurs as well. I think the best thing for us was connected. So, you know, we belong to different networks. So staying alone, if you have contacts and if you're part of a network, then you have people going through the same problems and you can face them together. You can ask for help. You know, you can think of new ideas, and this is what we and this is where we started to make new ideas of how to solve our problems. One of the things we did was like former participants. We have a community, and since we had to close our physical office, to go. But we wanted to do something more because it can work for you for free, but you know, to think them some return. So the volunteering became something of service exchange. You save money for your next trip to the United States and a cultural exchange program, then instead of paying for it, work for it, you know. And this is the way we're starting to get back around, trying to gather everyone. Actually, in September, we're organizing a conference, like, if any of you works with cultural exchange programs or abroad, then you're welcome to contact me in this conference. What we want to do is co-create creation, and we've already started with an organization in the United States, right? So this is something very important for us, and this is us get back on our feet at least for the next 6 months until, you know, we find new ways and to continue for the next 2 years at least, because we know that we over. So the next question for opportunities we can have in a post-pandemic world, and I think the key word there is opportunity. If we don't see this as an opportunity, we're lost. We have to see something that brings something new that we can think about, a new way of making business, a new way of making income for our organization. So imagine. So this is very important for you to think about. Actually, this time is the best time to make changes in your organization or to begin an organization. It's an opportunity, for example, for us, it was an opportunity to lower our costs because, of course, we don't have a physical office now, so we are working with help us, and I think it's going to help us in the future because things that we thought were, so we have to think positively in that way. Also, this is a good time to get support because a lot of people and a lot of like entrepreneur networks to help you, and so you can get this support. There are also a lot of funds from different international and local organizations that you can apply to with projects that will help your economy and support your business. Accessibility, that also has to do maybe with local credits from your government. Right now, this is not the best in a country, I have to be honest about it, but there are a few options. So you can also apply to that because a lot of people are in the same situation. So people are or to work there. So option you did way how to I have never been to social media like before, like this time than before, because they've been online classes. They're more, well, in our country we use a lot of, so whereas it has an opportunity. Then let's self-employment and entrepreneur, even with the chat roofing. And just quickly, you think, learn, make some research and see, what can help your organization and in the way you work, because there are many online tools, even free tools that you can use. So think you can capitalize. Sometimes we think that, I don't know, this workplace
Hey, Wendy, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but unfortunately the internet connectivity is really tough, and unfortunately you are getting cut off and broken, your comments are getting broken up. So why don't we stop sharing the screen and we can figure out how to best get your remarks up onto the Summit website after this event, so everyone has a chance to hear from you and your perspectives. I think I see where you're going with your comments, but unfortunately the connection is so slow that it's really tough to hear you. So I'm sorry about that, but we do want to get to a discussion. And then, yeah, we will be in touch with you about how we can record your remarks maybe separately and put them up on the track list, because it's super important perspective you're bringing from Bolivia and the LAC region, and also as a young entrepreneur who's been adapting your program in real time to COVID. So I really appreciate your remarks. I'm a little concerned that if we try and forge ahead, that the internet just won't cooperate. So thanks so much. We are getting some questions in as well, and so I wanted just to make sure we get to those. But Wendy has talked to me about some of the ways that her program, her company, which is really focused on international exchange and travel, has had to pivot and adapt. And we've talked also about kind of the role of youth networks, of entrepreneurship networks, and how important that's been to Wendy's program as she's adapted, connecting with peers and troubleshooting and problem solving together. And that's a big theme. Right now we have these networks of young people that are connected that can tap into resources and skills. I also thought, Wendy, you raised some interesting points here that I think Muhannad also touched on, and around the quote unquote opportunity of the pandemic, in that it's pushing organizations to have to move very quickly. It's in some places pushing innovation and adaptation. It's pushing us to get connected to resources and think in more systemic ways, and leveraging some of our networks. And we're all working in different contexts with different degrees of resources and capabilities, but I think that theme of having to pivot and adapt is happening at all levels, from governments to international NGOs to these digital platforms that Jessica, you were talking about earlier. So there were a couple of questions that came in, and I wanted just to get to them with the time that we have. And the first was actually for Jessica, and it relates to this broader issue of policy, although I think, Muhannad and Wendy, you could also answer this. The first was, do you believe that there should be social employment labor laws for gig workers? Different countries have different safety nets, and some countries have no safety nets for workers. Should there be better communication and awareness with young people and their governments around this issue? And it's an interesting one, in that the theme of upcoming International Youth Day is, engaging youth in institutions and engaging youth in policy. But this is a huge question that everyone is dealing with. We're dealing with it in the US, we're dealing with it around the world. And Jessica, you raised some interesting points here, and one, that the platforms themselves are doing a lot of work to train the labor force, to train young people, because they see it as a necessary investment they have to make to stay competitive. But what is the role of government versus platforms and training institutions? I mean, do you have some thoughts on kind of whether this needs to be a broader set of kind of policies writ large, or is it sort of place by place?
Yeah, thank you, Linda, for the question. And before I start, I should say that I'm not personally a policy expert, and this is definitely treading into waters that I'm not as comfortable in. But what I would say is that I think one of the responsibilities for government would be trying to get educational institutions to better prepare people for the workplace. We heard a lot of times from platforms that people coming onto their platform are just not ready for the world of work. And that's everything from vocational skills, like people with really outdated carpentry techniques, for example, down to digital skills. And that means that the platforms then are having to basically plug a skills gap that is left by government-run educational systems. And so I think that's one of the ways, one of the sort of responsibilities of government. And I think there's also an opportunity there, actually, to create stronger links between platforms and the private sector in general and government, because platforms have a really nice advantage of having instant feedback from customers. They know what customer demand is. They know what the needs of accessing work in the digital economy, what skills that requires. And so having that knowledge that platforms have feed into curricula at government-led skilling entities, for example, it is a real opportunity. I'm sorry I haven't really answered on the policy level, but at least on a practical level in terms of training, I think that's one of the things that we've heard demand for a lot from platforms.
Well, there's a related question here, which is, are there a minimum set of skills that you're seeing as necessary for young people to engage with these gig platforms, even before upskilling can begin?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. And thank you for that. So, I mean, I think it really varies platform to platform. Different types of platforms have different requirements. Obviously, like a ride-hailing company has requirements around driver's licenses, and the vocational, what we would consider vocational skills, are very greatly from different across different platforms, and we see that a lot the platforms do screen for those as part of their vetting process. So it's really difficult to sort of standardize that. What I would say is that, you know, we may not have tested this minimum yet, because I think platforms, you know, they're obviously running a business and they're sort of going for the low-hanging fruit right now, I would say, on the supply side. And so, and even going for that low-hanging fruit, as in people who are a bit more educated, who are more mobile, who have, you know, relatively good digital skills, even amongst that group, there are significant hurdles. Like a platform in Kenya, for example, told us how they have to take their tradespeople, there's a services platform, they have to take their tradespeople through really quite basic digital literacy training. So for example, people weren't aware of how to buy data bundles, how to know if your data bundles are running out, and it's like the basics of operating a data-enabled phone. So I don't think we've tested it adequately yet, but I also think even among the segment that's currently being targeted by platforms, there are significant skills gaps.
Great, thank you. I wanted to connect the opportunities associated with digital skilling and platforms back to a point that Muhannad, you raised earlier about accessibility challenges. This is I think a universal theme happening around the world as we've had to rapidly scale digital skilling and access to online resources and moving education online. What are some of the ways that you're thinking about bridging that divide? How do we start to address some of these issues of rural, you know, connectivity? Or maybe you can offer some examples of what's going on in Jordan right now or in the MENA region.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very important first. I'm going to mix this answer also with the policy together to respond in a more inclusive way. The most important thing we found that the skills that the youth need today have changed. So we used to say youth need communication skills, you know, time management, how to write their CV, and so on. But really today there's a transformation. Now youth need, from what we see and what we hear, need different kind of skills. Now we are talking about agility, we're talking about resilience, we're talking about more digital skills, and so on. So this change to address this and to make it inclusive for everybody, there should be a policy thinking together where government should not act alone, NGOs should not act alone, and private sector should not act alone. Just be more cohesive thinking together where government is engaged in early stage of a new innovative solution. And you have the not-for-profit working with the government and private sector also addressing this and funding it or supporting it, being part of the solution. So really, it's about aligning these players together if we want to have a sustainable intervention. So if we are going to talk about digital transformation, if one NGO starts to go and deliver, you know, digital literacy or digital program alone, it will not. It will have an impact, but it's not sustainable impact. Most likely, it's a project that has funding. It will have a start day, end day, checklist, and then it's not sustainable. But if we think of aligning the government and making the digital transformation inside the Ministry of Education, for example, and you have a not-for-profit working inside the Ministry of Education, where you have a curricula to teach, you know, the skills needed for the youth, engaging the parents from cultural issues, looking for funding to get equipment to ensure, you know, we don't exclude people because they don't have, you know, laptop or PCs, this is where we'll have, when we end the intervention, you have this approach in a systematic way. Like, it really is very interesting. In this pandemic, we have seen some students really going to their grandfather or grandmother parents or from their parents' home just to log on the PC to see a session that we have. So youth are really anxious about to be part of this. But without really having this system approach, and moving digital, you know, thinking is not going to be sustainable. In Jordan, what's happening now is that there is an initiative in Jordan that's led by the Ministry of Education, where we want to mainstream digital skills on all schools of Jordan. And we are part of this, you know, national initiative. The World Bank also is supporting this. And all the key players has to be engaged somehow together to ensure we deliver this as a national initiative to all schools of Jordan. And you have this transformation from a mindset, from a technical set, from awareness set to ensure, and of course hardware infrastructure to ensure this is lasting. So really, the policy should be there. The policy should be integrating and advocating to ensure this happens, and having the players together, the government with not-profit, with private sector, and the main provider of technology in the country to ensure they work together. It's not easy, but if it's done, you have a sustainable ecosystem change that will last.
I am muted. What do the conversations look like with your government partners, Muhannad, and maybe Jessica? I know you're not policy focused, but are upskilling platforms or digital platforms sharing with you kind of how some of these discussions are going with government partners? Muhannad, maybe I can start with you, and from the Jordan side, you said you referenced partnering with the Ministry of Education a few times in your remarks, and I just wondered what that looked like in practice.
Yeah, I can show you a real, highlight a real thing happening in Jordan that's already in full-fledged, which has to do about financial education. In this case, and this is what we're trying to do with digital skills. With financial education, what happened is that the Central Bank of Jordan had the vision of mainstreaming financial education in all schools of Jordan. So what happened, it was led by the central bank. So you have the government umbrella there and the vision there. And we had INJAZ, we had the Ministry of Education, we had all the banks in Jordan where they have worked together to make this happen. So INJAZ was designing the program with international partners, putting the program in schools, training the teacher and so on, in tandem with the Ministry of Education. And all the private sector banks and all the banks of Jordan were contributing around 1% of their revenues to the project. So this is a beauty today in Jordan. All schools of Jordan have financial education curricula that's being taught, like physics and math. And you have, it's part of the system. So now INJAZ has pulled out and you have this being taught as part of the system of the education in Jordan. So what we're trying to do is to do the same thinking with what's happening with COVID in digital literacy. And we want to really try to be part of this to ensure that there's mainstreaming of digital literacy and digital transforming happening in the schools of Jordan with you. So that's something we are aiming at with working with all these players, and it's led by Modi, which is the Ministry of Digital Transformation in Jordan. So it's the government umbrella. And the key players will be working together under this to try to make this happen, like what we did in financial education.
Thanks, Muhannad.
Interesting. I think from our perspective, the focus of our work is in sub-Saharan Africa, so I can only really speak for this region and only a handful of countries within this region. But what platforms told us is when they talk about trying to interact with government is they have sort of high levels of frustration with that. I think to generalize that there's quite a bit of skepticism from governments here towards the private sector in general, but I would say gig platforms in particular. And so I think there's not a good relationship there, and that's a pity.
Where does the skepticism come from, Jessica? Because you talked about the potential quite a bit, but.
Yeah, I think globally, there's quite a lot of skepticism towards big platforms for the reasons we've discussed here. The precariousness of the work, the lack of social protections, the lack of shared value with workers, and the valid points that are being raised. But as I said in the opening discussion, I think there's a lot of good as well that they contribute, particularly in emerging markets where you have these gaps that are not really being filled by other entities. And so in a way, that perspective, I think, is oversimplistic, and we need to tackle the problems head on, but also recognize that better relationships between government and these companies actually could favor everybody, including workers. So
Well, and beyond government as well. I mean, just considering the GYEO networks community, I mean, we're predominantly international youth development practitioners and implementing organizations. And we've seen some really interesting partnerships between, you know, NGOs and some of these platforms around skilling, sometimes a sort of bridge between training centers. And but it seems to be very small scale so far in terms of, you know, how organizations that are working with young people are connecting with these platforms. And I wonder if there's more of an opportunity there, you know, to engage with one another and have more of a dialogue about, you know, both the negative and the positive attributes of online skilling and digital work.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right, so we are coming up to time when we will transition. And Wendy, I have a lot of questions for you that are specific to being a young entrepreneur. There was a question from the chat about access to seed funding, and you know, I have questions about networks. I'm concerned about the connection, and I think there's probably going to be a big delay. So again, I think what we'd like to do is, if we can, record your remarks separately after this event so we can get a stronger connection going. Maybe when we aren't bursting at the seams with our Zoom platform and hundreds of people, and make sure that we capture your points after this event and get that up onto the Summit platform. But I just wanted to pose one last question to our panelists before I talk through how we're going to transition to the breakout sessions next. And maybe it's a bit of an unfair question, but you know, I was curious how optimistic you're each feeling about the road ahead. You know, and before this hit, our summit had been focused on the future of work, the changing economy. You know, there was a lot of emphasis on growth. And I think, you know, we saw how quickly, you know, the bottom of the economy fell out when COVID hit, and really emphasized, I think, the potential fragility of our systems, and that, you know, young people are in a somewhat precarious position. And now we're really thinking about the road ahead and rebuilding. And we've talked about the theme as being, you know, post-pandemic, but I don't know if there's going to be a post-pandemic. I think we really have to adapt to a new reality, and that there's opportunities within that. But I'm curious to hear from you, you know, how you're feeling about things in the different places where you work. You know, Jessica with digital skilling, and Muhannad with your work in Jordan around your own institutional adaptation. And Wendy, maybe you can chat it in the box about, you know, kind of as a young entrepreneur pivoting your own organization. How are you feeling about the future? And is there one thing that you hope to see happen in terms of a response to driving youth economic opportunity in the sectors where you work? Maybe Jessica, I can start with you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, to be honest, I think it's on us to turn this into a positive. Obviously, this is a really difficult time. A lot of people are really struggling, really suffering. And, you know, there are various different roles that we each can play in dealing with the immediate aspect of that. But I think we can turn there's an opportunity to turn this into a positive. You know, the way that it, for example, on the topic that we were talking about, that I was talking on, you know, this is what the game is really oriented that and really clearly, and to be able to turn it into a positive, we have to seize that moment and create more dialogue around it and try and come to ways to solve for that in a sustainable way. So it's on us to turn it into a positive as a community, I think. Thinking about skilling specifically, I think it's also an opportunity. I mean, now platforms are having to deal with a world that is much more digital than it was. We can't gather a load of people together in one place anymore and deliver training. We need to digitize that. And how do you digitize the interpersonal element that is so important for training effectively? That's what we'll be looking at in the rest of this year, is how can you digitize that important personal element. And the good part of that is it actually makes it much more financially viable to deliver training at scale. And that's a real opportunity. So, you know, it's on all of us to turn this into something for good in the long term, I think.
Yeah, that interpersonal piece is huge, and certainly as a summit organizer, we, you know, trying to translate our 4-day conference of 500 people, where there's so much valuable networking and face-to-face time and community building, to online is an enormous challenge, and not just for us, but for all organizations doing this convening work. So it's top of mind, and I think it's a really great point to raise. Muhannad, over to you for some final thoughts.
Thank you. You know, to answer this, it's a time of uncertainty. So you cannot now plan like as we used to do, like 3 years strategic planning, 2 years strategic planning. Really, you are planning month by month because we don't know what's happening and it's changing a lot. So this goes back to my initial thoughts. We need to be agile. We need to be flexible. We need to plan smartly, but also to be very flexible on a day-to-day work and month by month. So I think that's very important. We have seen really the impact of this on economic situation. We have seen many people, you know, either lost their jobs or their salaries has been reduced, or some of them cannot operate the same model. Many of our entrepreneurs also are facing a lot of difficulties. So there's a lot of happening, but at the same token, there is a lot of new opportunity that's coming out. So this is where, you know, entrepreneurship and our youth, we would like to work with them to look at these new opportunities and pathways and how we can pivot your, you know, products and services to go with the future. But definitely there's also an impact, not in Jordan, also in the region, on not-for-profit specifically, because, you know, you're not business, you don't sell product or services. You are mostly not-for-profit work on grants and fundraising and so on. And these are really looking at many of the organizations in the region. It really affected a lot not-for-profit. And I think not-for-profits now has to think in a different way of maybe looking at merging, working together, because it's not easy to sustain your work if you are not business, you are depending solely on grants, on fundraising and so on. So it's not easy, definitely. And still we also foresee that it's not clearly identified. Many of these things still are coming and unwinding in the coming few months. So, but I think my personal opinion is we need to plan on short intervals and to be very agile and flexible, and not to be stuck in one direction, to be always trying to navigate this and work together and try to align with the other NGOs to ensure that we align resources together. Thank you.
Still adapting to these technical platforms. Wendy, thanks for posting your last comments here. I wanted just to read it to everybody listening in. You said that, I think things are still going to be very challenging. However, I always tend to be positive. I think we will come up with a new business model that will work even better than before, and people, our clients, will be able to better understand the changes. Change is good. This is an opportunity to be reborn and grow. Spoken like a true entrepreneur. Thank you so much again, everyone, for joining us for this opening session, and thanks to our speakers for giving us your time and your knowledge. It's really great to bring these different perspectives together around self-employment and the impact of COVID-19. I'm going to quickly share my screen and just walk through next steps. All of you should have by now received a, let me just see if I can do this, an email with the instructions for how to join our breakout sessions. So we really hope that you will join us in those breakout rooms. And I just want to flag before we move on that we have a number of upcoming summit dates over the next few months. These are the tracks that I referenced at the beginning of this session. We invite you to join us for any and all of them, and we will also be adding additional events into this calendar on an ongoing basis. So please check back there. We can also add you to our mailing list. If you are interested in submitting content, resources, information relevant to youth economic opportunities, any of our tracks and the impact of COVID, you can send your submissions to my colleague Cole Simcoe, Senior Associate at Making Sense, at cole@makingsense.com. If you're interested in partnering with us as a sponsor or content partner, you can contact me at sarahs@makingsense.com. And I just want to quickly thank our team at Making Sense for helping us put this event together and managing the flow of today's conversation. Over to breakouts. You should have received an email by now. The instructions are also in the chat box of this meeting. Breakout sessions will run from 10:15 to 11:30 a.m. and we may lock rooms after the session begins depending on the numbers in the rooms. Just a reminder, please use the chat feature to communicate. Leave your cameras off. All presentations, including this session, will be recorded and posted to our Youth Economic Opportunities Summit website. And in all the sessions, a Making Sense staff person will be available to provide assistance if needed. So if you have any trouble, just put your questions in the chat. Thank you so much again, everybody. It's been a pleasure to have you, and thanks again to our speakers, and we look forward to welcoming you back to more GYEO Summit events online between now and the end of October. Take care.